glad to welcome you all to, this is part of our ongoing clinical seminar series, the New York Society for Bioenergetic Analysis, and I'm Scott Baum. I'll present tonight. And this is part of our effort to provide continuing education for ourselves and colleagues who are interested, and people who are interested in what we do, although tonight's subject is probably most attractive to therapists, so I don't know actually if all of you are, but I'm going to be presenting mostly as I would to therapists, and not a kind of general lay presentation. This is an abridged presentation of a workshop I did as a day-long workshop recently at the American Academy of Psychotherapists Institute and Conference in Philadelphia this past fall. I'm working on a project here, and I'll say more about that more toward the end. And I've been proposing that we invite people, and I've been looking at material and reading material that relates to this theme of psychopathy, which has been almost untouchable because the label is so intense that it dissuades people from further investigation. But it's a useful label and a useful organizing principle, more importantly. So we'll see how you feel about that by the end of this evening. I'll be interested in your thoughts on that. I'm going to divide the material into three sections. In the first, I'm going to talk about some of the energetic dynamics. Don't have enough time to do justice to the whole convergence of intrapsychic and interpersonal and developmental and family systemic and intersubjective and transpersonal dynamics that go into making people who they are. And our particular interest as bioenergetic therapists is to add the energetic and somatic organizations to that mix. So that's what I'm focused on here. It's not that I don't regard all those other elements as essential and significant to understanding this configuration. In the second section, I'll talk a little bit about the ways that those dynamics present themselves in a psychotherapeutic relationship. And again, I'm just going to use, if I have enough time, I'll use all three, if not two vignettes, mostly to sensitize us to the smell and sense of those dynamics in an ongoing therapy relationship. And then I will talk about some of the challenges that are presented by these dynamics in psychotherapy. And I'm going to offer perspectives both from the point of view of a therapist working as a therapist with a patient who presents these kinds of dynamics, and then from the point of view of the therapist and what it's like to encounter these dynamics, both in the other person and in her or himself. So, psychopathy is a distortion of the dynamics of narcissism. Narcissism, and this is not its everyday common usage, this is a technical usage. Narcissism is the process by which a person develops and regulates positive self-regard. In that respect, it's an essential developmental process. That's what Freud meant by it when he posited it. He did not mean self-love as a distortion. He meant it as a function. From an energetic standpoint, the somatopsychic structures that are involved in the development of the capacity for healthy, constructive regulation of positive self-regard, those energetic dynamics are intrinsically related to power. Therapists have a lot of issues with power. Most therapists, in my experience, come out of the ethos of anti-establishment, rejection of power as inherently authoritarian, abusive, exploitive, manipulative, and there's a renunciation of power. Now, I'll make the argument in a minute that the appropriate and constructive renunciation of power is an essential element in the successful psychotherapy relationship. I'll explain what I mean in a minute. But the reflexive, characterological, rigidified, anti-authority or demeaning of authority position, which many therapists have as part of our own history in liberating ourselves from whatever oppressive regime we grew up with and whatever political positions we've taken in our lives, that's actually quite unhelpful as a therapist. It's a prejudice, actually. It's a counter-transferential prejudice. And it interferes with the therapeutic work around the investigation and repair of damaged narcissistic structures. I'll come back to that later. That's a complicated issue that requires more discussion. So, power. Not much said about power. A lot about force, a lot about aggression, a lot about intensity, not much about power. The deployment of power in the early relationships that children have with all the authorities around them, that includes, of course, parents, older siblings, younger siblings, extended family, the doorman, the teachers, everybody who has any authority in their environment. That deployment of power is central to the formation of both structures and processes, which will become the foundation of healthy, successful narcissistic function. So, where does that start? Well, it starts at conception, as the developing fetus begins to compete with the mother for nutritional resources. It's designed that way. If the child just drew everything it wanted, it would get to be too big, and it would deplete the mother's calcium supplies. It would just pull whatever it needed. There is a negotiation from the beginning. It may be unconscious. It is, in fact, unconscious. And, of course, from the moment of birth, there is it's really an interesting phenomenon. One of the things about characterological material for me is how often it hides in plain sight. So we talk about the power of babies to compel action. In our popular culture, babies cannot be refused. They can keep you up all night. They can take whatever they want. They demand and compel and absorb and devour, and they're ravenous and they're greedy, but that's normal. Well, think about that in power terms. When we encounter people who behave like that in power terms, we have very strong reactions, I guess, for most of you, certainly for me, negative, not positive. So, I think even if you accept my generalizations for a moment and don't catch me up on this or that detail of how we've come so far, and it is true that Ben Spock has had tremendous influence, positive in my experience and my belief, but if we just make a cursory examination of social phenomena, we see this attitude about babies, about children, about their ravenousness and their cravings and their insatiability and their capacity to compel action, as though they have some intrinsic power. And that power has to be curbed. But that power is, and in energetic terms, real, actual, energetic, physical, emotional, psychological, if you wish, spiritual power. It is actually that, energetically speaking. So then we set up right from the beginning the idea that we can only curb this exercise of power, this deployment of this huge, ravenous, consuming power by dint of tremendous effort. It takes tremendous effort to curb the power of these creatures. And that creates the initial relationship framework for how we then deal with power from there on. The experience on the dependence end is that their power or his, is in fact all those things, and so very dangerous. And they enter into an arrangement, an accommodation, ultimately the people we see in therapy in a pathological accommodation with those around them, those authorities around them, to curb that power voluntarily. And in so doing, they create narcissistic deformations in that arrangement. And how does the person then regulate their positive self-regard if the very fact of deploying power becomes anathema? And if you're interested in a very concrete example of this, in this week's New Yorker, there's a first-person article by a woman who grew up in a very, by her own terms, WASP family. And the renunciation of power on the part of the authorities, and the effect that that has on her parents mainly, and the effect it has on them is really very dramatic. It's like a kind of, it's a sort of Garrison Keillor, Minnesota Lutheran, raised to some exponential power. But she's talking about real people and a real social environment. There's actually another one like that that I'm just trying to sort of come around and do this. Okay, so if we're going to look at this realistically as therapists, then we can't be bound by our prejudices in either direction. That is, we can't settle for identifying with the impinged on baby who's not allowed to be as powerful as she or he is, nor can we idealize this regular human being who's making an effort to deploy power. So there's some justification to this, right? Evolution has set things up in such a way, I don't mean that teleologically, the unfolding of evolutionary activity has brought us babies who are helpless for a very long period of time in their development, and they have no alternative for their survival but to have the capacity to compel action by others. That way of inducing instrumentality, right, that's central to what we in bioenergetics talk about in what Ron Robbins calls the limb character, and what I wrote about and didn't do much with, called the defensive character. That's a phase in the developmental process where the energetic structure is there to engage in contact and to induce the other to act because I can't act for myself. When we encounter patients who do that, we call them manipulative. Well, most likely that, if that's a deformation in their personality organization, that very likely started in this very early phase of development. When I used to work on an inpatient unit, that was one way that the staff would manage its hostility for patients who were pathologically manipulative. Well, yes, what would you expect? Would you expect people on an inpatient unit to make their requests in an embodied, individuated way? No, they all are sitting there thinking, I'm not going to get these people to do anything for me if I can't figure out a way to get them to do it. So for infants without some capacity to claim attention and to require compliance, they don't survive. We cannot rely simply on what we have, most of us think is a discredited idea of an maternal instinct. That is, that everything will well up in the authority, and the authority will then intuitively and in perfect attunement take care of the child, and the child is just a passive receiver of this.
Scott, a few minutes ago you said one of the parties cedes the power voluntarily.
Yes.
What
Well,
was-
we're not there yet. We have to wait on that.
Oh, okay.
That's coming. So here's the dilemma for the developing organism. Right? In order to survive and thrive, the organism has to be able to summon and hold attention, communicate, and that communication has to take place largely through an empathic nonverbal bond, at least until they're, some would say, adolescence, actually. Because before then, the developmental process isn't sufficiently organized. And part of that is that the personality isn't sufficiently organized to hold one's own in dialogue with an authority. I'm not just talking about language. I'm talking about the whole embodiment of, I have something to say, I expect you to listen, I expect you to respond, I will respond to you. That whole transaction, that's not really a childhood transaction. That's an early adult transaction. So they, at their end, they need to be in relationship with someone who is willing to be receptive and influenced by the power they deploy to communicate these needs and feelings. So that's a very simplified version, right? I understand that. It's a lot more. But what I want to do now is I want to give you just a couple of minutes of an experiential contact with what it means to embody power. Now, power, I'm not talking about rage, I'm not talking about grief, I'm not talking about emotion yet. I'm just talking about the body experience of touching your own power. Now, when you do that, it's not, this is not a universal, it's not an idealized version, it's whatever it is for you. But I'm going to invite you as an experiment to set aside or transcend or imagine yourself past some of your own characterological inclination to take up the characterological position of the powerless or the impotent or the broken down or the incapable, and feel what it would feel like for a moment to feel powerful, not disempowered, not unempowered, not castrated, not devalued, but actually